First of all, good afternoon. My name is Laurence. I'm the interim CEO for the Association for Consultancy and Engineering, and delighted to welcome you all to this webinar on the Construction Playbook, particularly focusing on delivery model assessments, which we've organised and are running alongside the Construction Leadership Council. Very much today's discussion, as I say, is about the playbook. Specifically, we want to explore how the right delivery model approach is going to help enable clients and the industry to work together, delivering those best possible outcomes, and really looking at some of the optimal splits of roles and responsibilities. As you can see from the screen, we've got 4 great guest speakers today. We've got Fergus Harradence joining us from BEIS, Tim Bowen from Keltbray, Andrew Cubitt from HS2, and Terry Stocks from Atkins. I'll return to them all in a minute. Hopefully, in terms of housekeeping, by now you're all fairly familiar with what we're going to do. Please do ask any questions you'd like to during the session through the chat box. Your questions will remain anonymous, but we'll try and cover as many of those as we can as we go through. We don't have fancy presentations today. This is very much about a discussion. So what we're going to do is have each of our speakers give us a few minutes of their time, a few thoughts and a few insights. Then we'll enter into discussion and then open up for questions and the like as we go. So by way of opening then, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our first speaker, Fergus Harradence from BEIS. BEIS obviously being a key driver and an agent for change in the playbook. So I'm delighted to welcome Fergus. Fergus, over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Laurence. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Fergus Harradence, Deputy Director for Infrastructure and Construction in BEIS, but probably more pertinently from the perspective of today's presentation, I was actually closely involved in the development of the playbook across 2020, coordinating engagement with industry, feeding in on a number of the chapters, and I was actually the author of the chapter on modern methods of construction and digital technologies. So hopefully I can share some of the learning that I got from that process around the aims of the playbook and how it should be taken forwards with you today. But just to start with a few words on the approach to delivery model assessment set out in the playbook as the theme of today. This is covered in chapter 5 of the playbook, and really what government is saying in this is that selecting the right delivery model is a crucial determinant of project success because it sets the framework for collaboration between client organisations and firms. And the playbook proposes an approach to determining what the best delivery model for a project should be. It suggests that work on this should start early in the preparation and planning stage of the project or programme. It should take place in parallel with work on defining the outcomes, strategic approach and value definition for the project. Should cost models should be used by default as part of the planning process to inform delivery model assessment as well as prospective budgets for the projects. And actually projects and programmes should also benchmark the key deliverables around costs, the schedule, the carbon emissions and other outcomes for each stage of the process as part of business case development. And this is something you should be reviewing during the planning phase. So the playbook also includes a process map for taking this work forwards based on 6 stages. Firstly, they suggest that we do work at an early stage to frame the challenge. So this is really about the client organisation deciding both what type of organisation it is in terms of its own capabilities and approach, but also looking at what outcomes it wants to achieve and the extent to which it wants to be actively engaged in the project or whether it wants to be more hands-off. Secondly, it should identify the data inputs and potential delivery model approaches. So it's very much pushing organisations away from using the default options that they have used in the past or which they prefer and getting them to be more open-minded and ask more questions and say, from the perspective of this project and what we want to achieve, what's the best way of going about delivering it? It also encourages departments to consider both the strategic and the operational approach. So how does the delivery model align with wider organisational strategy? What approach will best enable the project or programme to meet the objectives of the construction playbook in terms of its overall approach and for example, using things like digital and off-site manufacturing technologies to deliver the project? What's the ultimate approach to asset ownership and management going to be? Is the market capable of delivering a particular model that the client organisation would like? Does it have the capability to do that? And also then identifying the risks. What are the key risks and which organisation is best placed to manage these? The fourth stage of the process is about undertaking a whole life cost assessment. Again, I mean, something that is a theme of the playbook is to try and push client organisations away from a narrow focus on upfront capital costs in project or programmes and look at what will deliver best value over the life of the programme. And this should be done through using benchmarking and a should cost model. Also then aligning the analysis of all of these factors to create a clear recommendation and explain why a preferred option has been identified for the delivery model, why others have been discounted, and then to review and test this. And then finally to design a commercial strategy and make sure that the approach to procurement, contractual management, the form of contract, and the performance management framework for the contractors and the wider supply chain that will be delivering the project is aligned with the delivery model. And we have a high level of confidence that it will deliver the desired outcomes. In terms of the should cost model, which is an absolutely fundamental part of the approach to delivery model assessment, and the playbook emphasises the importance of this being a genuinely whole life model for the project, not just the build phase, that this should be based on benchmarking and the analysis of data and good practice from similar projects rather than just picking ones that are less relevant or ones the organisation itself has done previously. And benchmarking should not just be about cost, that's one element of it, but benchmarking the schedule, greenhouse gas emissions and outcomes with what's been achieved in other projects is important as well. And also the importance of completing this at an early stage. This is not seen as something that should be a bolt-on at a later stage of the procurement process and to inform conversations with the contractor. It should be done at an early stage and in time to inform the engagement and dialogue with the whole supply chain as part of the early market evaluation phase. And then that gives scope to refine the should cost model over time and take account of developments. And there are a few examples of useful guidance that are cited in the playbook. So the project initiation and development route map, the construction innovation hub value toolkit, which we're encouraging all contracting organisations in government to embed in the decision-making process. There's a should cost modelling guidance note, which has been produced as part of the outsourcing playbook, but I think a lot of the guidance set out in that is equally valid in the case of construction. And then some IPA best practice around benchmarking and benchmarking, the benchmarking capability toolkit. So just quickly to conclude and recap on the key points. Firstly, selecting the right delivery model is seen as vitally important and a determinant of project success. It should be done as part of the planning and preparation stage, not later on in the process. It is all about delivering the best outcome over the whole life of the asset and about promoting effective collaboration with the supply chain. And it should also inform the development of the commercial strategy for the project overall. So I will stop there. Obviously, I'll be around for the whole seminar. I'm very happy to answer any questions, but I'll hand back to Laurence now.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Fergus. That's a really good framework to sort of help us with our conversation. Yeah, I think getting that right delivery model, but also that pushing away from the default option. I think that's that could form part of the conversation I think we're about to, or I hope we're about to have. So without further ado, thank you again, Fergus. Let's move on and hear from our other speaker. So I'm going to pass now to Tim Bowen from Keltbray Holdings. Tim.
Thank you, Laurence. So I'd like to speak for a few minutes on what I've seen key themes in the construction playbook that I have seen in the past that work best, and perhaps some of the things I've spoken of to avoid that I have also seen. Starting off, there's a theme running through the playbook about creating long-term relationships, and that I'm very supportive of, because it very much helps us keep consistent groups of people doing similar things to help with productivity, and it allows us to invest in ourselves. So a whole theme about production efficiency and learning curve and continuous improvement works really well. And also the incentive from a contractor, if they're seen to be doing well on a particular piece of work, that there's the promise of the follow-on work to come afterwards is also a really positive motivator. There's another strand in the frame in the playbook around consistent forms of construction productization. So some of the best ways that we can become efficient is by either building no asset at all, or less, and then making the asset that we build simple in its form and repeatable and standardized. So often we see, value engineering that we put in place of bridges with like very small skews in, for example, that can be taken out. And these are areas that we learned from clients who are building supermarkets. That they have mastered the technique of building the same time and time again, and deploying lean techniques in terms of really driving out waste, and they've honed the should cost model to some degree. The third one is alignment of incentives, and it's something we see quite a lot to ensure that incentives align from procurement to completion. So sometimes we see procurement whereby the procurement teams are not necessarily those who are vested in the ultimate operations, and almost operate in a parallel universe during the procurement phase, and consequently the operations teams feel that they've been delivered a set of contractors that are not necessarily aligned around incentives, and have had to compete in a particular form of contract or a particular form of procurement that doesn't necessarily give collaboration the best start when it comes to operations. So that's something that I think is particularly important. There's a theme around, particularly for very complicated schemes, and it's something that we have learned in the past, and in some respects have perhaps forgotten, around difficult, complicated schemes where the pricing is very difficult. There's lots of stakeholder involvement. The use of early contractor involvement, both from a tier one and deeper in the supply chain, is hugely important to surface, scope issues, surface methodology and program issues that really help, as I say, surface risks and ensure that they're allocated to the party best able to carry them. There are a number of opportunities that I've worked on in the past where the contractors are expected to take heroic pricing assumptions in very short periods of time, and it's all's well so long as you get away with it, 9 times out of 10, but sometimes you don't, and that with the very obvious consequences. Visibility of pipeline is another strand that I pick up, and that's hugely important, particularly as we look to drive the productivity agenda and look to increasingly mechanize our service offering, because it gives us the confidence to invest in ourselves, capital assets that will help with productivity, and it gives us the visibility of the pipeline that we're going to be able to depreciate that asset over a period of time. There's a sharing culture in the playbook, and I think the industry is exceptional at sharing safety-related issues and events because of the never mind the legal aspects of it, the moral aspects of keeping everybody safe. I think I think we are excellent at sharing safety-related issues, but probably not as good in other quality or productivity-related. So I'd very much like to see some more done in that regard. And to those ends, it would be great if we could get increasing data standards so that we can almost in real time flow data from the work phase as to what our productive norms are or what our buy-in rates are for materials, right the way through to an electronic design process, so that we are always automatically updating prices and programs as things are getting designed. So that would be something I'd like to see. Another thing that we see is quality promises are made during bidding processes and sometimes forgotten and not necessarily policed. We would really like, as an industry, as we gear up around carbon and social aspects, that the quality promises that are put into bids and marked that are they ensure that they actually happen in reality. And two final ones I'll pick on. Innovation is hugely important. I don't see how we're going to get to where we need to be without innovation, but we need huge assistance in order to get these innovations over the line. There needs to be a tolerance of the learning, and a tolerance that we really can't. I think the exact term in the playbook is we can't innovate without increasing our risk. So we certainly see that as contractors, and a tolerance of that it would be hugely appreciated. At a final plea, and I know it's Ed McCann's topic, but a proper look at productivity across the whole life cycle would be hugely appreciated. Looking at the cost of delays in decision making, for example, that would be great if we could really focus on all of the whole life cycle productivity. So those are a list of things that I've seen, strands that I've picked up from the playbook that either work really well or some things that I've seen that don't work well, so things to avoid. And I'll now hand to Laurence. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. It was good to see that Fergus talked about looking at things for the whole life and being timely, and there's several of the things you've identified there, which actually demonstrate where we compartmentalize the whole journey, don't we? And look at it in isolation, just our own particular chapters. So certainly some things that we should look to explore on that later on. That's really great. Thanks very much for that, Tim. I'm now going to invite Terry Stocks to say a few words. Terry works with Atkins, and Terry, you've heard the others. So we've had some scene set, we've had the contractor's view. Interested in your view, please. Over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Laurence. And I guess what I wanted to share is how we've actually used it in practice for one of our clients. So just a sort of bit of a pen picture of a case study. But Fergus and Tim have given a great overview of the playbook, but it sits within a bigger framework. So we've got the government through IPA and of course BEIS that have developed a core set of policy. So that includes the Transforming Infrastructure Programme, the TIP document. We've got the Value Toolkit that sort of sits alongside that, and of course we've got the Construction Playbook that we're talking about today. But they're all aligned strategies to support the delivery of better outcomes, improved outcomes. And they all call for a coherent and holistic vision to be stated, right at the start of a programme to allow a project to be tested against. And the policy initiatives provide a robust projects and programme development and delivery process, and that sets out to protect that end benefit. The TIP and the Construction Playbook have a really big push for the adoption of modern methods of construction, digital integration, and sort of to demonstrate a real focus on social payback. That's the sort of big drive. So clients need to evaluate the fitness for purpose of their own current process and their practice for delivering projects, and then how they support the outcomes that they want. So in order to deliver against government policy and initiatives and to the client identified values and the strategic outcomes that they want, the playbook approach supports a robust challenge of the existing approaches that they are adopting, and it promotes that building of knowledge and awareness of the supply chain. So as we've spoken about through Tim and Fergus around sort of understanding the supply chain and being able to engage with them in the right way. So just to reflect a little bit on a case study, we've recently completed a commission for a key government department that wanted to use the Value Toolkit and the Construction Playbook to review their alignment of their sort of 3 potential approaches to MMC. So the 3 that they wanted to focus on was volumetric, so using a sort of volumetric approach to building supply, timber panel, and platform. So running the Value Toolkit has helped to identify the corporate value drivers required. So in this case, it was sort of social value, it was productivity and climate, so carbon, came out as their key drivers. There were sort of subdivisions of that, of course, but they were the sort of key headings. So when we took the 3 MMC approaches and we then sort of broke them down into subcategories. So we said, look, are they sort of fully contracted? And what's the impact? What's the impact of the program if it's a low volume program or a high volume program? And the other point that we were looking at with this particular client was that they had access to internal client workshops and internal client labour. So it was, what's the impact on using their internal workshops and labour at low and high volume as well? So it had contracted and sort of internal adoption. We ranked the MMC approaches against the identified value drivers, and then also ranked their sensitivity for compliance with the Construction Playbook policies. So ranking compliance with the playbook enabled us to see the relative impact non-compliance would have in delivering the potential benefit. So as an example, risk, if the approach to risk as written in the playbook is not followed, and a simple policy of placing risk with the supply chain rather than taking a risk share approach, the impact on delivering the benefits of a platform approach were much higher than if they'd have gone down the volumetric approach. So it was trying to highlight the key areas of the playbook that we should really focus on to deliver this sort of outcome for the solution against the value driver. We then use the playbook to test the client's procurement and delivery processes and their practice against the playbook. And we could then identify gaps and compare the gap with the relevant impacts of delivering the outcome benefits for each of the MMC approaches. And then bringing all that data together, we could rank each of the approaches against the stated client value outcomes and the likelihood of delivering the potential benefits of each of those MMC approaches. So for this client, the platform approach was identified as being the most aligned with their stated outcome values. However, their commercial and delivery processes were more aligned to large volumetric approaches, which actually wasn't a surprise because that was their sort of normal method of delivery. But we were able to develop a roadmap for change, highlighting the key areas that had the largest impact on delivery of benefits. So this included engaging with the lower tier supply chain providers rather than purely tier one, looking at contract and risk models that promote the adoption of innovative partnerships and delivery models, and engagement with the supply chain to support and reflect the capability and grow the future capability and capacity of the supply chain. So, there was a sort of disjunct. We had platforms that really sort of hit their requirements for value, but their procurement and process practice and the way they was going to the market sort of suited this sort of volumetric outsourced approach. So in brief, the approach identified the value chain. So if you think of the sort of value chain, the bottom left is a potential, a good initiative. And at the top of that value chain, it's the delivered value. What we were able to use the value toolkit to do and the construction playbook to do was to get the links between what's a good idea and how we can optimize the benefit, such that we didn't get a sort of a lower curve trajectory, so we would have missed those benefits. So just a sort of practical example in being able to use the value toolkit to really drive differences across a complete client organization. So I'll stop there, Laurence.
Thanks, Terry. Well, there's certainly some food for thought in there, and certainly I can see some questions coming to you in terms of which ones to focus on first from all of that. But it's really interesting to talk about the understanding the sensitivity of those things and how they interact and how they come together to drive that successful delivery. So thank you very much indeed for that. So our final speaker is Andrew Cubitt from HS2. So Andrew, you've seen the scene, you've heard from contractors, you've heard from advisors, you've heard from government. What's it like from a client's point of view?
Thanks, Laurence. And look, what a great set of speakers to start with. And it's great to talk a little bit about the client perspective and how we've implemented it. But I'm Andrew Cubitt. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm the Procurement Supply Chain Director at High Speed 2, so responsible for all third-party spend and supplier engagement at HS2. So it's a big responsibility, which I take very seriously, and great to speak to you today about it. We have also been part of the construction playbook right at the very start with Fergus and looking at how we inputted into it, but also how we've also got some of those processes already in place. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about DMA and then try to articulate one of the challenges that we had and also how we've applied it in practice at HS2. I think lots of the speakers have already picked up on many of the really, really important points about engaging the market and understanding what the market requires. And that really is my job. My job is to understand what the market is and then how to then procure it from our perspective. And we do that in lots of ways. But the important thing is, I think like Fergus said, this is not an afterthought. It's about framing the challenge up front. So we thought about framing this challenge before we started and what that strategy looks like. And we test that with the market, crucially, prior to then proceeding with it. The example I'm going to talk about in accordance with the model is our common component strategy. So at High Speed 2, we obviously big infrastructure project, but also building quite a few big stations. And in those stations, there are a number of components which are common. I say components in a sort of a wide sense, but these components are quite big. There are big assets like lifts and escalators, but it includes a number of things which will be common across those stations. Now, having that as the backdrop, we thought about, well, what's going to be the delivery model against these things? And we thought about some of the process that we would think about, some of the lessons learned we've got before, and particularly we tried to learn lessons from our other parties that are similar elsewhere. So Heathrow, TfL, Crossrail, Network Rail, lots of different agencies to try to understand how they've inputted these things and how they've driven out value, because this is about value, and we're looking at how we then get the best from the market, but also get the best from our own supply chain as well. So part of this approach was think about the assessment of whole life cost, and that is a key fundamental point about DMA in the construction playbook. So these assets in stations do obviously have a whole life cost that naturally attributes to them. Some of them, when in operation, will have a significant operational cost, but also a drain on electricity if they're electrical products, or also the maintenance procedure. So we look at how we frame that whole delivery model, and then how we construct the commercial model to fit behind that. And that's exactly what we did with these common components. So we learned from our counterparts, we understood what the components were required, we identified which components would add the greatest value, and then we developed a whole life cost model. And at that point, that's when we then test this with the market. So it's really important that there's a market in place to bid against this work. So we have to then share this before we start any procurement, share that with the market, share that with the suppliers who are going to be part of this work to get their view. And their views have a big impact. And in this case, it does have a big impact. So we often adjust where we're thinking we might procure this, or how we might procure it, the timing of it, but also even the whole life cost model. We might think about, well, actually these things are important. This is how the market looks at them. And I can give you some examples. So in some case, we might look at the availability in the operation sense to think about then how that affects the overall capital investment that we might make. You might not want something that is out of sync with the availability and the capex. So we need to think about how the whole benchmarking of all the costs across the whole life cycle of those particular assets. So once we've got that back, and we did in this case, we did get that back from all the common components that we're procuring at HST, some that are currently in procurement, but also the lifts and escalators procurement, which has already been procured. This is the whole approach to start before we even start the procurement. And that's that supplier interaction which really drives the operational strategy before we then set this off in motion into a procurement strategy that we actually put forward. So we think about the supplier interaction, we think about the market, we think about the risk profile for the assets we're buying, and we also think about then how we want to operate those in the future and where that funding might come from. This is all borne out in a project initiation document, and this is again part back to best practice in the construction playbook. A whole suite of expertise is brought into that PID, and then that then sets out the decision matrices of how we're going to then make that decision going forward. So the whole concept about whether it's make or buy, decision-making trees about the evaluation, and then the opportunities and risks that are with this approach effectively. And this is where we then start to lock down the delivery model at this point. So you've gone through the stage of strategizing, you've gone through the stage of understanding the market, you've gone through the stage of understanding how you do this commercially. Then there's a whole load of supporting activities which then support to procurement, and that's about when the market's got capacity to deliver this, and also those packaging approaches that we might split these things up into. And in many cases, we might put them into lots depending on how the market's going to respond, but also the benchmarking besides the should cost modeling that we would need to derive. Exactly what we did with common components, and exactly what we're doing with common components at the moment. These separate components that would be procured separately based on the market feedback, based on industry best practice, based on our counterparts in other parts of the public sector. And that's really defining our effective commercial strategy for how we buy things, which is absolutely aligned to the way the construction playbook works. So hopefully that's a good practical example of where we've done that. And look, back to Laurence now for some questions. Thank you, Laurence.
Great, thanks very much, Andrew, and thanks for sort of wrapping together some real good common themes that have come through from all four of you. So my thanks to all of you for that. Just in terms of Fergus, you opened and said, you've been here, dare I say, since the start in terms of early involvement, early engagement, and some authorship. We've heard from each of the speakers there about what it's intended to do, how it's starting to work, and the like. But in terms of client adoption, from your point of view, are you seeing that clients are openly adopting this, adopting parts of this, slow to adopt? And then probably a secondary question behind that is, what do you think clients need to do in terms of investing in the training that they and their teams need to fully understand it, embed it, and drive it into their organizations?
I think the fairest categorization at the moment is probably that we're seeing partial adoption. I think there's a genuine desire and intent on the part of many contracting authorities in government to adopt the playbook. I think almost all of them have taken at least some steps towards implementing the approach that it specifies, but it's inevitably the case with all organisations when confronted with a very challenging change programme, which is ultimately what the construction playbook is, that requires an upgrading of organisational capability across the board. Many organisations in government find it easier to do some bits than others because it's aligned with existing operations, processes or capabilities that they have. And if I was going to be critical of government, what I would say is that I think a lot of organisations have focused today on the bits of the playbook that they know they can do. So I have seen some organisations that are already quite advanced in areas like the use of MMC. Yes, they're definitely going further. Similarly, organisations that have a high level of capability in relation to things like BIM, yes, absolutely, they are doing things that align with the playbook. The way in which organisations are engaging with the market, yes, I think that's changed, and I think that's improving. And I think government is starting or trying to be more realistic about its approach to the cost of construction projects, and also challenging the industry a lot more about whole life outcomes, particularly in relation to carbon. And I've certainly seen a number of contracting authorities in government, the ones under the auspices Department of Transport, the Environment Agency, doing that. Where I think we're weaker are in some of those areas which are potentially transformational, but where we lack the capability. And I would point to digitisation of the supply chain as an example of this. If we digitised the process of payment management, contract management, quality assurance, the potential payoff for the industry in terms of productivity and performance would be vast. Unfortunately, I don't think industry or its clients really has the capability to do that. And that is an area that we need to work on over the next couple of years. And then I think the other area where things have been a bit slower, it has been in relation to some of these issues around risk allocation within contracts, contractual terms and provisions, where we are getting consistent complaints from the industry that whilst the language is changing, the clauses within the contracts are not, and organisations do still default to the position of trying to protect their own commercial interests, rather than taking a step back and saying, actually, how do we embed the playbook approach and have a fair and balanced allocation of risk across the supply chain and issues like that. So that would be my summary of the status quo.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I think the comply or explain card is definitely one that's being used an awful lot at the moment. It is the feedback I'm getting and seeing. Terry, from your point of view, just that point about client training and understanding of this, just your views in terms of is it starting, is it getting embedded?
I think there's a bit of sort of sector in this and client size. So talking with a lot of local authorities, I think they see some of the aspects of the playbook aligned to sort of large scale programs, and then others that are more aligned to sort of smaller scale programs. So I'd say that certainly from a local authority perspective, they are sort of aligning with some of it, but not all of it. And I think there's a little bit of sort of unpicking that says, well, actually, if you start to work cross authority, which a lot of them do, they may be able to create some sort of larger program opportunities that can unlock some of those other drivers of the playbook, like a bigger adoption of platform, perhaps in a sort of resi setting. So I think the bit about training and awareness, for me, I think it's more about awareness than training, because I think if they're aware of what it's trying to do, so yes, it's trying to put up productivity, absolutely, but I think the overriding push of the playbook and certainly the tip is to sort of try and drive a bigger public benefit from the capital we spend. So, you know, using MMC, that's great, gives you productivity. But if we can use factories more, actually we start to sort of share the social impact of the pound that we spend. We can start to sort of operate factories that are in, you know, away from central London, for instance, if our project's in central London. We can start to bring in SMEs a lot more. We can start to get a much more diverse labour set within a factory than we can on a building site. So we start to get those big sort of social benefits as well. And I think it's trying to sort of drive awareness of we're doing this not just to deliver an output, but an outcome. And speaking to local authorities and sort of central government clients, I think there is an awareness of that. And it's then trying to sort of drive it through their own organisational culture. Because at the moment, very much you get finance departments, you get procurement departments, you get delivery departments, you get operational departments, and it's trying to get everybody to work together to try and say, right, what's our joint outcome and how are we going to hold ourselves to account for that?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Terry. I think Tim, you picked up on some of this as you were going through, just talking about, actually you were taking it onto the incentivization part, just in terms of, you know, are we all aligned on that on the way through? Just your thoughts, please, on that point of, are clients really starting to engage with this, and are they starting to get that message through, and the training piece in terms of that messaging, or where are the gaps?
So I agree with the comment that was made that we're seeing is sector specific. So in some sectors it's being embraced more than in others, and in part as opposed to in whole. But you know, this is a long road that we're on here. So many of the ideas and comments in the playbook are not new. They are ideas that have been around for a long time, from studies that have occurred over many years that were either not implemented or partially implemented, or implemented and then we've reversed away from them for whatever reason. And so the fact that it's you know, not universal across the sectors and only in part being taken up, I don't think is the end of the world. Far from it. More important for me is every element that we implement, we make it irreversible and sticky. That doesn't mean that, you know, on all projects, all of the elements in the playbook, you know, need to be deployed. So, for example, there may be some very, very simple one-off construction projects that are bought by clients that don't need to follow the principles of the playbook. So, you know, there may be some in there that are of use, but you certainly wouldn't need to deploy them all. I think, you know, one of the most important things is it's irreversible, and, you know, that clients as procuring organisation and specifying organisations put in their procurement documents what it is they would like to see from the industry. So, you know, if we genuinely want to see, you know, increased effort around productivity, then let's put that in the procurement documents and measure it. Back to my point about ensuring that quality promises are followed up upon and implemented, because it's an incredibly powerful tool. You know, we as contractors are all about selling clients what they want to buy. So we're taking market signals from the documents that we see in front of us and endeavouring to, frankly, win the work. And so we will do everything in our power to focus our quality promises on the very definitive, you know, items in the procurement document. So what I would request is put in that document what you want to see, the industry that you'd like to see, and I'm pretty sure that the industry will respond in turn.
Okay, thank you. So just moving on from there, Andrew, you talked about your common items and how it sounded like you'd had some very, very good engagement back from the market in terms of to shape your procurement thinking. So some great examples there. But there's always a suspicion. There's always a suspicion that, yeah, that sounds great during the consultation phase, but actually when it comes to the cold hard procurement, things are going to change. How rigidly are you managing to stick to the feedback you've had in terms of really adopting, really changing, and particularly really looking at that whole life cost benefit that you're seeing, or that the market is telling you could be realized from that?
Yeah, so my job is to engage the market and listen to the market and convince the executive in HS2 and also wider government that this is the right approach. So that's my job. My job is to understand where the market is, and that constantly changes. So the reason for that is because it's really, really important that we listen to the suppliers and supply chain, because otherwise, without that, you're not going to get competition. So if you set the wrong strategy, then you're not going to get the right competition. The bidders and suppliers and contractors won't be able to formulate a bid which is competitive and even with inside our budget if it's the wrong type of risk model or commercial model or even whole life cost model. So all these things are very, very sensitive, and they must be aligned to what the supply chain require. So that's the first thing I would say about just the continuation about whole life cost models. So I think we've got a bit of responsibility to think about the blend between capital program and then operational delivery, which is that those two things never sit well together sometimes. And sometimes on a capital program, you have to think very seriously how you're going to operate in the future. And that's where HS2 is. So we're absolutely thinking about how we operate and also how we deliver this massive infrastructure program. And then the final point I would say is that it's also my role, I think, I think Tim made a good point about how we need to sort of set the industry some targets about what we might think about productivity. And I think the job that I've got is to think about, well, rather than just saying productivity, then trying to think about the precise areas where we're going to try to drive that productivity. Is it in low carbon concrete? Is it in something else, and how we deliver the overall construction program? That's work, in fact, I'm on the steering group with Ed McCann to look at. So we were very, very in tune to all these things. And I think we are absolutely always listening to the market.
Yeah, good, thank you. One of the other things that Tim mentioned was the issues around innovation, and he used the phrase about tolerance when learning. Just in terms of a degree of forgiveness, almost in that process. I'm curious. I suppose, Andrew, I'm going to come back to you on that one. In terms of, I know as an organisation, as a client, you're pushing for innovation. You're looking at how can the industry improve and take things forwards. How much tolerance as a client can you afford to give the industry? To Tim's point.
Well, I think we've got to look. We are definitely haven't got all the answers, and I don't think the supply chain has either. So I think actually much of this stuff is going to be quite innovative, and it's going to push the boundaries of where I think the construction industry wants to go, or has been before. Let's put it that way. So therefore, the tolerance I think we need to provide is the commercial constructs around the tolerance, so that supply chain and the contractors can innovate. So we've got an ambition, and we should be able to set some of the parameters around what that ambition means really, really clearly. And let's take low carbon concrete. So we should be able to say what low carbon concrete means. It's about manufacturing that concrete, but it's also about the logistics of moving maybe the manufactured blocks near, in our case, the trace or the site that you're building. So we need to parameterize that as almost like a problem. And then we need to put a commercial construct in place which allows our contractors and our supply chain to then be innovative without a commercial penalty, so that we can get what we need from this overall project. So that's the tolerance I think we can provide, and that's how I think it will work.
That's useful. Yeah, thank you, Tim. Any views, response on Andrew's comments there?
I think that's right. So, having been involved with a number of innovations in the past, often some of the areas of sensitivity that I've found is the person that owns the problem doesn't necessarily own the process of getting the innovative solution licensed or accredited, and so you'll be having a pull through from a certain part of the client organization and a pushback in a certain other part that's trying to get it licensed and accredited. So that's one area that I've seen. The other is that when you deploy innovative technologies on the first time of asking, often they don't quite deliver as promised. They will eventually, after you've learned and go through a number of iterations and cycles, but they often don't quite, in my experience, don't quite get there. So is another strand. And then it's, sticking with it to go through the learning cycle to get it over the line. And then the third strand that I've seen is that there's a view that some innovative technologies will be the answer to all of the problems. And so there's technology stretch across areas that it was designed for into other areas, And then when it fails in these parallel areas, then there's a view that the technology doesn't work at all, whereas really it was taken out of context as a solution to a problem in a slightly parallel part of the that where the solution was being sought. So those are some of the strands that I've seen in the past that were challenging.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Terry, you talked in your example, you talked a little bit around the sensitivity of different playbook elements, and I think if you go back to Fergus's introduction about the number of different things that we really want to try and focus on, how we pull it together and how it knit it together, I was intrigued by the idea of actually looking at different elements in a sensitivity way. Was there anything in there that you sort of said? I know you sort of said there's a couple of areas that really stood out, but if you were just starting this conversation with a client who says, you know what, I've heard about the playbook, I've really got to get involved in this, does the sensitivity take you to starting the conversation on a particular place, a particular area, a particular focal point to get that initial engagement and win?
Yeah, I think when you sort of approach the playbook, I think you start off with a value toolkit, actually, in my mind, because you've got to get that value matrix sorted out, as a client that says, right, what's important to me for this project? I think once you've got that, you can then sort of make it a judgment that just says, right, are we trying to do something that's novel? Are we trying to do something that's innovative? Or are we trying to do something that's an industry norm? I think once you start to get a realization of that as a procuring body, whether it's just the client or whether it's a client with their client-side team, I think the answer to that is then, well, how do we engage with the supply chain? So if you're trying to go down a novel approach, say like platforms, for instance, then you need to have that early supply chain engagement that says, right, where are we as an industry? Are we going to start to approach our requirement over a year? Is it going to be 5 years where we want to get to? But you start to sort of build up that realization. And so for me, it's the playbook really starts to give you that evaluation of where are we as an organization? What are we trying to, where are we trying to get to? And the example that I gave was the client body in question were really good at working through tier ones to develop large scale projects using volumetric. When you started to break that up and say, well, actually, we might start to build components through individual workshops and then tie it into an integrator type contractor, then the conversations that you need and the relationships you need with your supply chain are very different. And I think that started to then sort of bring up those sensitivities that just says, right, we operate the way that we do, we're never going to get to the sort of value outcomes that we want as an organization. And I think that's a big conversation for a client then that says, are we really wedded to the value outcomes that we think we want, or are we not? Because there's a big decision to be had.
Yeah, that's a great point and great summary. Thank you. I think one of the real challenges, and I can see it mentioned in the chat as well, is the issue about that you say about starting with the value toolkit and the like, is actually when we say about value and we say about whole life costs and we say about the sensitivity around that. Certainly a lot of feedback that members have given me has been, that's great until we get to the point where actually it sounds great in whole life, but I've got a capital budget, and the capital budget is set, and I can't move that. So it was an interesting conversation about the values, but I need to go back to capital. Fergus, maybe start with you on this one, but just how do you think we start to shift some of that mindset or get people to approach that and value that in a different way?
I think it is a challenge, particularly for organisations. I noticed local authorities came up in the chat that do have constrained capital budgets, but I think the culture around this is starting to change, and there has been more and more emphasis within government placed on the importance of shifting away from a lowest capital cost focus. And this is not just in terms of saying, well, we need to take account of whole life costs. it's actually being framed much more in terms of the wider social value and the positive impact that a project can create if you're prepared to spend more money, whether that's in terms of driving economic growth or encouraging innovation, whether it's in terms of socially focused programs like skill development ones, whether it's in terms of promoting biodiversity or reduced carbon emissions. So I think the culture is gradually changing. But it is, I think, inevitably going to take time, and you are always going to be up against what, for individual organisations, can be that quite strong countervailing pressure around existing budgets. But in terms of changing their approach and changing their thinking, I mean, I think the important thing is that we do start pointing to some of these innovative solutions and ways in which we can improve industry productivity and performance. Because you look at some of the innovations we've supported through the Transforming Construction Challenge, we are seeing greater than 10% improvements as an average in terms of things like productivity, speed of delivery, and actually not necessarily upfront capital costs, but certainly whole life costs, because we're confident in the quality of the asset that we've produced. And these, I think, are the arguments that contractors and consultants need to start putting to client organisations. It's that there are better ways of doing this, and actually investing in them now means that in 4 or 5 years' time, you will be spending less upfront in terms of capital costs, because the industry will be better at delivering.
Yeah, that's thank you for that. I mean, Tim, you raised the issue about a proper look at that productivity across the industry, and I suspect that everybody in the process looks at their own part and thinks it's someone else in the chain that's where the problem is. But from your thoughts on that, where would you say to those local authority clients who sort of, we've cited here as having the biggest challenge, where would you encourage them to look, do you think, in terms of how to get the best value from us as a combined industry rather than our individual parts of it?
Yeah, so if we can get consistent groups of people doing largely the same thing time and time again in roughly the same place, then we can deploy lean techniques and we will get really, really efficient at it. So if we can keep that in the back of our mind, that I think would be one approach. The other approach is that, there's a whole bunch of cost and productivity right the way through the whole life cycle that we could look at, from work winning costs that are roughly 1.5% of turnover for a typical contractor, for example, where we get non-standard forms of contract or heavily amended. So they take an enormous amount of time and effort to review those, right the way through to the way we could be most productive is to lean, not build anything at all, or make it smaller, or make it consistent. All of those things, I think, will help us become much more productive as an industry.
Okay. Thank you for that. I'm conscious we're coming into the last few minutes, but it is heading up to Christmas, and at least one of our speakers has made an effort with some Christmas decorations. But I'm just intrigued from all of us, really. What would you like the industry or the clients of our industry to deliver to support the playbook use in next year? What's the Christmas gift we can actually give each other to make the playbook really work and really drive some improved value and productivity across our industry? So Fergus, let's start with you on that one, please.
What I would really like to see is people across the supply chain collaborating and trying to grip some of these difficult challenges that do require that level of engagement, whether it's digitization, it's improved contractual practices, it's improved payment practices, which I admit is a bit like being the kid that wants the Xbox, the Scale Electrics, and the new bike for Christmas. And I've probably shown my age with a few of those references there. But I think that is something that could make a huge difference to the industry over the course of 2022.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, I'll carry on round then. So Tim.
Thanks very much, Laurence. So, well, something I'd like to look at, and particularly, is driving out waste. So, and particularly, what I feel is that prelim costs on our construction projects are getting seemingly larger and larger as every year goes by, what I would like to do is have a good look and collaborate with industry partners to see how we can start to not necessarily get prelim costs back to where they were 20 years ago when we were super thin, but I think there's a whole area of waste there that I think I'd really like to look at.
Great. Terry, what's in your stocking?
Collaboration was up there, but seeing as Fergus has got that, I don't want to waste the chance of another gift. So I think the overarching bit is don't let perfection be the enemy of the good. I think, you know, let's embrace this, and we're not going to get it all right or 100% incorporated in the short term, but actually let's take it as an overall concept. But I think one of the things that we spoke about around sort of capital cost and making that investment. So I think for me, I think there is a bit around for client bodies and for supply chains to think of the end at the start. So because if we start to embed the requirements that we want at the very start of a project and really start to think about what's the environment that we need to set, so we can create an environment, a landscape that we can be successful on in delivering our outcomes. Actually, the capital cost won't be any more, I would say, could be even less, because you probably have less changes of scope as you're developing your design. You've got sort of less changes as you're going through the project, and when you finish, you've probably got sort of less works to do. That so the operator can actually turn it into something that they want. So I think starting at the end, thinking of the end at the start, and making sure that those requirements are clearly identified and sort of built into that outcome.
Thanks, Terry. And Andrew, your Christmas list.
So not list, but one thing. So low carbon opportunities and outcomes. So I want, and I'm really, really passionate about driving this industry into a place where we are delivering low carbon products, low carbon efficient outcomes and delivery models. And I think if we don't do it this Christmas, then I think we're going to be in real trouble to work out how we're going to get to net zero by 2035. This is something that we can't put off for 3-4 years. We've got to do it right now. My job is to influence it, but also help the industry by setting out the whole life cost model, which will allow for that to happen. So that's what I will do, but I need the innovation back. So that's it. Thanks.
Brilliant stuff. Thank you very much indeed. And look, we are very close to the end of the hour, and starting with the end in mind, we definitely want to finish on time. But one of the other things I was keen that we did deliver was a really engaging conversation and some really useful insights. So my thanks to all of you. Thanks to Fergus, to Tim, to Terry, and to Andrew, and to everybody on the chat who's contributed with some comments and questions. I look forward to anybody who gets that collaborative contract in their stocking. If they could send a copy around, that would be great to share across the industry for sure. Again, thank you to everybody. It's been a really, really good conversation, really lots to think about, lots to go for. I'm confident that that 22 will bring a lot more chance to collaborate, to deliver that value, and to really kick out the silly little things that we do that add waste on the way through. So on behalf of ACE, on behalf of CLC, thank you very much for attending. Have a great rest of the day. Thanks very much indeed. Bye-bye.
Thank you.